Jeremy. Today is day 84 of reading. Today we're reading Harry Potter and the Chamber of Secrets. Let's get started. We're on page 136. The horses galloped into the middle of the dance floor and halted, rearing and plunging. At the front of the pack was a large ghost who held his bearded head under his arm, from which position he was blowing the horn. The ghost leapt down, lifting his head high in the air so he could see over the crowd. Everyone laughed and strode over to nearly headless Nick, squashing his head back onto his neck. "Nick!" he roared. "How are you? Head still hanging in there?" He gave a hearty guffaw and clapped nearly headless Nick on the shoulder. "Welcome, Patrick," said Nick stiffly. "Lie buns," said Sir Patrick, spotting Harry, Ron, and Hermione and giving a huge fake jump of astonishment so that his head fell off again. The crowd howled with laughter. "Very amusing," said nearly headless Nick Dudley. "Don't mind Nick," shouted Sir Patrick's head from the floor, still upset we won't let him join the hunt. "But I mean to say, look at the fellow." "I think," said Harry hurriedly, and a meaningful look from Nick. "Nick's very frightening and, ha!" yelled Sir Patrick's head. "Betty asked you to say that." "If I could have everyone's attention, it's time for my speech," said nearly headless Nick loudly, striding toward the podium and climbing into an icy blue spotlight. "My late lamented lords, ladies, and gentlemen, it is my great sorrow," but nobody heard much more. Sir Patrick and the rest of the headless hunt had just started a game of head hockey, and the crowd was turning to watch. Nearly headless Nick tried vainly to recapture his audience, but gave up as Sir Patrick's head went sailing past him to loud cheers. Harry was very cold now, not to mention hungry. "I can't stand much more of this," Ron muttered, his teeth chattering, as the orchestra ground back into action and the ghost swept back onto the dance floor. "Let's go," Harry agreed. They backed toward the door, nodding and beaming at anyone who looked at them, and a minute later were hurrying back up the passageway full of black candles. "Pudding might not be finished yet," said Ron hopefully, leading the way toward the steps to entrance hall, and then Harry heard him. Rip, tear, tear. It was the same voice, the same cold, murderous voice he had heard in Lockhart's office. He stumbled to a halt, clutching at the stone wall, listening with all his might, looking around, squinting up and down the dimly lit passageway. "Harry, what are you?" "It's the voice again. Shut up a minute." "So hungry for so long." "Listen," said Harry urgently, and Ron and Hermione froze, watching him. "Kill, time to kill." The voice was growing fainter. Harry was sure it was moving away, moving upward. A mixture of fear and excitement gripped him as he stared at the dark ceiling. How could it be moving upward? Was it a phantom to whom the stone ceilings didn't matter? "This way," he shouted, and he began to run up the stairs into the entrance hall. It was no good hoping to hear anything here. The babble of talk from the Halloween fairies was echoing out of the great hall. Harry sprinted up the marble staircase to the first floor, Ron and Hermione clattering behind him. "Harry, what are we?" "Shh!" Harry strained his ear. Distantly from the floor above, and growing fainter still, he heard a voice. "I smell blood! I smell blood!" His stomach lurched. "It's going to kill someone!" he shouted, and ignoring Ron's and Hermione's bewildered faces, he ran up the next flight of steps, 3 at a time, trying to listen over his own pounding footsteps. Harry heard all around the whole of the second floor, Ron and Hermione panting behind him, not stopping until they turned the corner into a last deserted passage. "Harry, what was all that about?" But Hermione gave a sudden gasp, pointing down the critter. "Look!" Something was shining on the wall ahead. They approached slowly, squinting through the darkness. High words had been dabbed onto the the walls between two windows, shimmering the light cast by the flaming torches. The Chamber of Secrets has been opened. Enemies of the hair, beware. What's that thing hanging underneath? Said Ron, a slight quiver in his voice. As they edged nearer, Harry almost slipped. There was a large puddle of water on the floor. Ron and Hermione grabbed him, and they inched toward the message, eyes fixed on the dark shadow beneath it. All three of them realized what it was at once, and leapt backward with a splash. Mrs. Norris, their caretaker's hat, was hanging by her tail from the torch bracket. She was stiff as a board, her eyes wide and staring. For a few seconds, they didn't move. Then Ron said, "Let's get out of here. Shouldn't we try and help?" Harry began awkwardly. "Trust me," said Ron. "We don't want to be found here." But it was too late. A rumble, as though a distant thunder, told them the feast had just ended. From the either end of the corridor where they stood came from the sounds of hundreds of feet climbing the stairs, and the loud, happy talk of well-fed people. Next moment, students were crashing into the passage from both ends. The tattle, the bustle, and the noise stopped suddenly as the people in front spotted the hanging cat. Harry, Ron, and Hermione stood alone in the middle of the corridor, as silence fell among the mass of students pressing forward to see the grisly sight. Then someone shouted through the quiet, "Enemies of the hair, beware! You'll be next, mudbloods!" It was Draco Malfoy. He had pushed to the front of the crowd. His cold eyes were alive. His usually bloodless face flushed as he grinned at the sight of the hanging, immobile cat. Chapter 9. The Writing on the Wall. "What's going on here? What's going on?" attracted no doubt by Malfoy's shout. Argus Filch came shouldering his way through the crowd. Then he saw Mrs. Norris and fell back, clenching his face in horror. "My cat! My cat! What's happened to Mrs. Norris?" He shrieked, and his popping eyes fell on Harry. "You!" he screeched. You've murdered my cat! You've killed her! I'll kill you! Out!" Argus! Dumbledore had arrived on the scene, followed by a number of other teachers. In seconds, he had swept past Harry, Ron, and Hermione and detached Mrs. Norris from the torch bracket. "Come with me, Argus," he said to Filch. "You too, Mr. Potter, Mr. Weasley, and Miss Granger." Lockhart stepped forward eagerly. "My office is nearest, Headmaster's, just upstairs. Please feel free." "Thank you, Gilderoy," said Dumbledore. The silent crowd parted to let them pass. Lockhart, looking excited and important, hurried after Dumbledore. So did Professors McGonagall and Snape. They entered Lockhart's darkened office. There was a flurry of movement across the walls. Harry saw several of Lockhart's pictures dodging out of sight, their hair in rollers. The real Lockhart lit the candles on the desk and stood back. Dumbledore laid Mrs. Norris on the polished surface and began to examine her. Harry, Ron, and Hermione exchanged tense looks and sank into the chairs outside the pool of candlelight, watching. The tip of Dumbledore's long, crooked nose was barely an inch away from Mrs. Norris's fur. He was looking at her closely through his half-moon spectacles, his long fingers gently prodding and poking. Professor McGonagall was bent almost as close. Her eyes narrowed. Snape loomed behind them, half in the shadow, wearing the most peculiar expression. It was as though he was trying hard not to smile. And Lockhart was hovering around all of them, making suggestions. "It was definitely a curse that killed her. Probably the transmogrific torture. I've seen it used many times. So unlucky I wasn't there. I know the very counter curse that would have saved her." Lockhart's comments were punctuated by Filch's dry, racking sobs. He was slumped in the chair by the desk, unable to look at Mrs. Norris, his face in his hands. Much as he detested Filch, Harry, thank you everyone. That's all for today. Bye. See you tomorrow.